Attention! A real story verified by a team specializing in the paranormal, with testimonies, images, and received documents. Proceeding may shock or disturb you and affect your emotional and mental state. Watch at your own risk.
My name is Robert Mitchell. I am 55 years old and I live alone in a Victorian house in the suburbs of Salem, Massachusetts. It's one of those old constructions with wide porches and tall windows that creak when the wind blows hard. The white paint on the walls peels in some spots, and the floorboards groan under my feet as if the house were breathing with me. I've spent most of my life here. I raised my children in this house. I watched my wife pass away 7 years ago. Since then, it's just me, the silence, and the memories that echo through the empty hallways. I don't mind the solitude. In fact, I've learned to appreciate it. But there are moments when the silence feels too heavy, as if something invisible were watching my every move. The neighborhood is quiet. Young families, children playing in the tree-lined streets, the kind of place where everyone knows each other by name. During the year, it's peaceful, but when October arrives, something changes. The trees lose their leaves, the air gets colder, and a thin mist begins to cover the streets at dusk. It's as if the entire city were preparing for something no one can name. And then comes Halloween, the night when the boundaries between our world and the unknown seem thinner, the night when everything I'm about to tell began. The night I discovered that some doors, once opened, can no longer be closed. That Halloween, I didn't plan on doing anything special. I bought a few bags of candy the week before, more out of obligation than enthusiasm. Assorted sweets, small chocolates, the kinds of things kids expect to get. I put everything in a large ceramic bowl near the front door. The afternoon was grey and cold. I lit the living room fireplace around 5 o'clock when the sun began to hide behind the trees. The orange light of the flames danced on the walls, casting elongated shadows that moved like silent figures. I sat in my leather armchair with a book in my hands and a hot cup of coffee beside me. Outside, I could already hear the first laughs of costumed children. Small groups walked along the sidewalk, accompanied by watchful parents with flashlights. Their cheerful voices broke the street silence. It was comforting in a way, a reminder that life went on even when mine seemed to have stopped in time. Around 6:30, the doorbell rang for the first time. I got up, grabbed the candy bowl, and opened the door with a polite smile. 3 little kids shouted, "Trick or treat," with enthusiasm. I handed out the candy, wished them a good night, and closed the door. Simple, normal, exactly as it should be. I went back to my armchair. The fire crackled softly. Everything was in order. But as I turned the pages of the book, I noticed something odd. A sudden silence outside. The children's voices had stopped. The street seemed too empty for a Halloween night. And then 3 sharp knocks echoed on the door, not the soft sound of the doorbell. Knocks, loud, insistent. I set the book aside and walked to the door. The knocking had stopped. I opened the door and looked outside. On the porch, lit by the yellowish light of the exterior lamp, stood a boy. He looked to be around 10 or 11 years old. He wore simple clothes, dark jeans, and a grey t-shirt under a light jacket. There was no costume, no Halloween accessory. Just an ordinary boy standing there, hands in his pockets. His face was serious, expressionless, and his eyes were fixed on me. I waited for him to say something. Trick or treat, perhaps, but he just stood there, motionless, staring at me in silence. I found it strange, but I took a handful of candy from the bowl and held out my hand to him. He didn't move. He didn't extend his hand. He didn't say a word. He just kept looking at me. After a few awkward seconds, he finally raised his hand slowly and took the candy. No thank you, no smile, nothing. He turned and went down the porch steps, walking along the sidewalk until he disappeared around the corner. There were no parents waiting for him, no group of friends. I thought he was rude, but kids are sometimes like that. I closed the door and went back to the living room. I kept reading, But something about that encounter bothered me. The lack of manners, the strange silence. No group of friends. I thought it was rude, but children can be like that sometimes. I closed the door and went back to the living room. I kept reading, but something about that encounter bothered me. The lack of manners, the strange silence, the way he just stood there, waiting. I shook my head and tried to focus on the book. 15 minutes later, the knocking returned. 3 sharp knocks, exactly like before. I frowned. I got up again and opened the door. It was him, the same boy, in the same position, with the same empty expression, as if he had never left. I looked down the street searching for parents or guardians. No one, just him. I gripped the bowl tighter and looked at the boy. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me with those empty eyes, waiting. I felt a pang of irritation. I grabbed a few more candies and placed them in his hand, this time with less patience. He took the candy, turned, and walked away again, disappearing in the same direction as before. I closed the door more forcefully than I intended. This was starting to bother me. What kind of child returns to the same house twice in 15 minutes? Where were his parents? I went back to the armchair, but I couldn't read. I kept staring at the door, waiting for the knocks to return, and they did. Half an hour later, 3 sharp knocks, methodical, identical. I got up quickly and flung the door open. There he was, same position, same expression, same hand extended, waiting. This time, I felt anger rising. I looked at him firmly and said I had already given enough candy, that he should go to other houses. He didn't respond, he didn't blink, he just kept his hand extended. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I took a single piece of candy and placed it in his hand. He took it, turned, and left. But this time, I watched. I saw him go down the steps, walk to the sidewalk, and simply stop. He stood there, with his back to me, motionless. He didn't leave. He just stood there like a statue in the darkness of the street. I quickly shut and locked the door. My heart was beating faster now. This wasn't normal. It wasn't just bad manners. It was disturbing. I turned off the porch light, hoping he'd understand there was no one else at home. I went back to the living room and sat down, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking at the door, waiting for the knocks to return. They returned. 20 minutes later, 3 knocks, stronger this time. I didn't get up. I sat in silence, waiting for him to give up and leave. The knocks stopped. Silence. I breathed a sigh of relief, but then I heard footsteps, slow steps on the porch. He was walking back and forth, testing the windows, looking inside. I rose from the armchair and walked to the living room window. I gently pulled the curtain aside and looked out. He was there, standing on the porch, with his face pressed against the glass, looking directly inside. Our eyes met. My blood ran cold. I dropped the curtain immediately and took a step back. The knocking started again, stronger, more insistent. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, like a ritual, as if he knew I was inside, watching. I grabbed my phone, thinking of calling someone, but who? The police? To say that a child was knocking on my door. Then the knocking stopped. Absolute silence. I waited, tense, every muscle in my body alert. And then I heard it. The front doorknob turning, slowly. Testing. I was sure I had locked it, I was sure. But the doorknob kept turning, lightly creaking in the silence of the house. I ran to the door and checked the lock. It was engaged, but the knob was still moving. On the other side, I could feel his presence, standing there, waiting. I pressed my ear to the door and heard breathing, slow, heavy, very close. He was leaning against the door on the other side, so close that only a few inches of wood separated us. Suddenly, everything stopped. The knob went still. The breathing ceased. Silence. I stepped back from the door, cold sweat running down. I waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. Slowly, I gathered my courage and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. He had gone, finally. I took a deep breath and returned to the living room. I sat in the armchair, trembling. I looked at the clock. It was almost 9 at night. Halloween was ending. The streets were silent. I took my glass of water and drank, trying to calm down. It had been bizarre, but it was over. He had gone. That's when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, a dragging sound, as if something were being moved. I froze. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. The chairs around the table were out of place, all pushed aside, as if someone had passed through there. But I hadn't gone into the kitchen since the afternoon, and all the doors and windows were locked. My heart raced. I started checking the entire house, every room, every window, every door, everything locked. No one could have entered, but the chairs were out of place. And then I saw it, on the kitchen table, the candy, the same candy I had given the boy, carefully stacked, one on top of the other, forming a small tower in the center of the table. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands. This had gone too far. I didn't care anymore if it would sound ridiculous. I called the police. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. A boy disturbing my property, entering without permission, leaving things inside my house. The dispatcher was polite and said she'd send a patrol car. 20 minutes later, 2 officers were at my door, Officers Thompson and Garcia. I explained everything again. The repeated visits, the strange behavior, the moved chairs, the candy on the table. I could see that look in their eyes, that mix of professional patience and skepticism. An older man alone, complaining about a child on Halloween. Officer Thompson suggested I show them the security camera footage. I had a camera installed on the porch, facing the front door. I had completely forgotten about it. Of course, the footage, the proof. I took the 2 officers to my office, where the computer was connected to the security system. I sat down and started rewinding the recordings. I looked for the time of the first visit, 6:30 in the evening. Found it. I hit play. The officers leaned in to see the screen. And then we watched. I peered on the screen, opening the door. I stood there, looking outside. I extended my hand with the candy. I waited. And then I closed the door. Alone. There was no one on the porch. My stomach churned. I rewound to the second visit. Same thing. Me opening the door, looking at nothing, extending my hand to the void, talking to myself, closing the door. The third visit, the fourth, all the same. In none of them was there a boy. In none of them was there any child. Just me opening and closing the door, talking to the air. Officer Garcia cleared his throat uncomfortably. Thompson asked me if I was feeling okay, if I was taking any medication, if there was anyone who could stay with me that night. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the screen, watching myself repeatedly open the door to nothing, to no one. They left a few minutes later. They said if I needed anything I could call, but their tone had changed. It was no longer professional. It was worried, pitying. They thought I was crazy, that I was seeing things. And maybe they were right. Maybe I was. But then I looked at the kitchen table. The candy was still there, stacked, real, solid. I could touch them, and the cameras don't lie. But I saw that boy. I felt his cold fingers. I heard his footsteps. He was there. I know he was. After the officers left, I was alone in the silence of the house. I sat on the living room sofa with all the lights on. I couldn't stop trembling. My mind spun in circles, trying to find an explanation. Any explanation that made sense, but there was none. I looked at my hands. There were no signs of dementia, hallucinations, or any condition that could explain what happened. The doctor said I was fine, perfectly fine. That was 5 years ago, 5 years since that Halloween. And nothing else has happened. No strange visits, no moved objects, no knocking on the door. The house went back to what it always was. Quiet, peaceful, normal. I still live here. I go on with my life. And nothing, absolutely nothing supernatural has happened again. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Those cold fingers, those empty eyes, the moved chairs, the stacked candy on the table. All of that was real. It doesn't matter what the cameras showed. It doesn't matter that the officers looked at me with pity. I was there, I lived it, and physical evidence doesn't lie. Something was in my house that night, something that shouldn't exist. Over time, I learned to live with that certainty. I don't talk about it with anyone. People don't understand, they don't believe, and I don't blame them. I myself would doubt it if someone told me this story. But I know the truth. I know there are things in this world we can't explain, things that exist beyond our understanding, things that for some reason choose to reveal themselves to some people. That boy was at my door. He was there. And whatever he was, wherever he came from, he left his mark. Not just on the moved objects or the returned candy, but on me. In the absolute certainty that reality is much stranger and scarier than I ever imagined. This is my story, the story of the boy who was at the door, or who wasn't, depending on who you ask. But I know what I lived, I know what I felt, and I carry that with me every day. Sometimes I wonder who he was, or what he was, why he chose my house, why he chose that night. Was it just Halloween mischief taken to a level I can't comprehend? Or was there something else, something deeper and more disturbing? I will never have those answers, and maybe that's for the best. What I can say is that that night changed the way I see the world. It changed the way I see my own house. Every shadow, every creak, every inexplicable sound now carries a different weight. A possibility I would once dismiss as imagination. But now I know that not everything can be explained. Not everything makes sense. And not everything we see is real to others. So if you're listening to this story, I want you to think about the times you felt something strange, the times you were sure you saw or heard something, but there was nothing there, the times reality seemed to bend just for an instant. Maybe you weren't imagining it, maybe there was something there, something only you could see. And if one day, on any Halloween, you hear insistent knocking at your door, if you open it and find someone who shouldn't be there, someone who looks at you strangely, who doesn't speak, who just waits, remember my story and ask yourself, are you really seeing what you think you're seeing? Or is something else happening, something the cameras can't capture? Because in the end, the question that haunts me is not whether that boy was real. The question is, what if he comes back? What if, on some future Halloween, I hear those 3 knocks again? What will I do? Will I open the door? Or will I pretend I'm not home, knowing that perhaps he's already inside? This is my story, and now it's yours too. Thank you for listening. If you liked it, or if this story left you uneasy, leave a like. Comment below if you've ever experienced something similar, something you can't explain, something no one believes, but you know happened. And subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Real stories, disturbing stories, stories that will make you question reality. Until next time, if you have the courage.